Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the most complex and haunting chapters of modern history, the story of World War II Germany. From the ashes of defeat after World War I to the rise of a powerful and terrifying regime that reshaped the world. This story is one of ambition, ideology, tragedy, and endurance. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy the type of content that merges myth and mystery. And hey, let us know from where you're watching. What time is it for you right now? It's time now to dim the lights, relax your mind, and let's cover what we have for tonight together. When we talk about the story of World War II Germany, we can't begin in 1939. The real roots stretch much deeper, back to the end of the First World War. Picture Germany in 1918, cities still standing, but morale completely destroyed, soldiers returning home to a nation that felt more defeated than devastated. The Kaiser, Emperor Wilhelm II, had fled into exile, and for the first time in modern German history, the monarchy was gone. What replaced it was something new, untested, and deeply unstable: the Weimar Republic. Now, the people who came back from the trenches weren't just soldiers, they were symbols of a country that felt betrayed. They had fought for 4 long years, endured unimaginable hardship, and suddenly their leaders surrendered. Many Germans couldn't comprehend it. To them, the army hadn't lost the war on the battlefield. It was stabbed in the back by politicians, revolutionaries, and supposed traitors at home. This myth, the Dolchstoßlegende, or stab in the back legend, would become one of the most poisonous ideas to infect post-war Germany, and later, one of the most effective tools in Adolf Hitler's rise to power. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, only deepened this wound. The terms were brutal. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, something that humiliated its people to the core. They had to pay reparations, equivalent to hundreds of billions in today's money. The once mighty German army was reduced to a symbolic force. No air force, no submarines, no tanks, and only 100,000 men under arms. Territory was stripped away. Alsace and Lorraine returned to France, parts of Prussia to the newly reborn Poland, and all of Germany's overseas colonies were gone. Even the proud industrial Ruhr region was occupied by foreign troops. For ordinary Germans, this wasn't just politics, it was daily life. Inflation soared. In the early 1920s, money lost its meaning entirely. You could go to a bakery with a wheelbarrow full of marks and come home with a single loaf of bread. People burned cash for warmth because it was cheaper than buying firewood. Savings vanished overnight. Families that had once been middle class were suddenly destitute, and all of it was blamed on Versailles, and by extension, the democratic politicians who had signed it. Yet amid the chaos, the Weimar Republic was trying to be something remarkable: a modern democracy in the heart of Europe. Its constitution guaranteed free speech, women's suffrage, and cultural freedom. Berlin in the 1920s became a place of wild creativity: cabaret clubs, avant-garde art, experimental cinema. It was an explosion of modernity. But this was a double-edged sword. While intellectuals and artists celebrated freedom, conservatives and nationalists saw only moral decay. They looked at the new Germany and saw weakness, not progress. Politically, the Republic was fractured. Dozens of parties competed for power, from communists on the far left to monarchists and nationalists on the far right. Every election felt like a crisis. Governments came and went in months, sometimes weeks. Street violence became a common sight. Armed groups of leftists clashing with right-wing militias. And beneath it all, the sense of humiliation persisted, simmering, waiting for someone to exploit it. One of the most symbolic moments came in 1923, when France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr region after Germany fell behind on reparation payments. The German government encouraged workers to go on strike, to resist passively. The government printed even more money to support them, and hyperinflation spiraled completely out of control. Prices doubled by the day, then by the hour. People were paid twice daily so they could buy goods before prices rose again. An entire generation lost faith in the idea of stability. And yet, the story of the 1920s in Germany isn't just one of despair, it's also one of resilience. By 1924, the Dawes Plan, backed by American loans, helped stabilize the economy. For a brief few years, Germany seemed to be recovering. Factories reopened, culture flourished, and diplomacy improved. The Locarno Treaties of 1925 even saw Germany invited back into the international community. It looked like peace might truly hold, but beneath the surface, the scars hadn't healed. The bitterness of Versailles remained. Many Germans still viewed democracy as something foreign, imposed by their enemies, not chosen by their people. They longed for unity, pride, and a strong hand to lead them. And while the political center struggled to hold, extremist voices on both ends of the spectrum grew louder. In Munich, a new kind of movement was forming, one that combined nationalism, racial ideology, and the promise of renewal. It was led by a man who had served as a messenger during the Great War, a man who saw defeat not as a tragedy, but as a betrayal. His name was Adolf Hitler, and though in the early 1920s, he was just another radical in a beer hall, he was already shaping his message around the pain of a nation that felt wronged. To understand why so many Germans later followed him, you have to imagine their mindset in these years. Imagine a young man returning from the trenches, his family's savings wiped out, his pride crushed by defeat. He walks through streets plastered with foreign flags, sees foreign soldiers marching in his homeland, hears his parents talk about hunger, inflation, and humiliation. Then he hears someone speak, passionately, furiously, about restoring honor, rebuilding strength, making Germany great again. It's easy to see how that voice could feel like salvation. By the late 1920s, the Weimar Republic stood at a fragile balance, prosperous on the surface, but fractured within. No one could have predicted the storm that was about to hit. In 1929, when the Great Depression struck, it shattered whatever stability Germany had found. The American loans vanished, the economy collapsed again, and unemployment skyrocketed. And in that chaos, the voices of extremism returned, louder than ever. The aftermath of World War I didn't just end one conflict, it planted the seeds of another. Versailles didn't bring peace, it created resentment. Democracy didn't heal the wounds, it exposed them, and Germany, humiliated and hungry for redemption, was drifting toward a dark and dangerous future, one that would soon consume the world again. When people talk about Germany in the 1920s, they often picture it as a decade of wild nightlife, experimental art, and jazz-filled cabarets. And yes, that's true, but it's only half the story. The Weimar Republic was a country living in extremes. It was both dazzling and desperate, progressive and perilous, bursting with innovation, yet constantly on the edge of collapse. Imagine a nation where you could attend an art exhibition that challenged everything you believed, then step outside to find political street fights and hunger protests happening right down the road. That was Weimar Germany, a place where modernity and misery coexisted every single day. After the horrors of World War I, Germany's leaders tried to create something entirely new. The Weimar Constitution, drafted in 1919, was one of the most liberal of its time. It guaranteed free speech, freedom of religion, women's suffrage, and proportional representation in parliament. On paper, it was a blueprint for a modern democracy. But the problem wasn't the system, it was the people's trust in it. Many Germans never wanted democracy to begin with. To conservatives, Weimar was a symbol of surrender, born from the ashes of defeat and imposed by the Allies. To the far left, it was a betrayal of the revolution that could have made Germany a socialist republic. So from the very start, the republic was surrounded by enemies, from within and without. The early years were brutal. Political violence became an everyday occurrence. In 1919, the Spartacist uprising, led by radical communists like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, tried to seize power in Berlin. They were crushed by the army and right-wing paramilitaries known as the Freikorps, groups of disillusioned ex-soldiers who would later form the backbone of Nazi street movements. The Freikorps were brutal, violent, and fiercely nationalist. Their suppression of leftist revolts left deep scars in German politics, breeding bitterness that never fully healed. But even as bullets flew in the streets, something extraordinary was happening in German culture. Artists, musicians, and writers were redefining what it meant to create. Expressionism, Bauhaus, Dada, movements that shattered conventions and embraced the chaotic beauty of modern life. Painters like Otto Dix and George Grosz captured the madness of post-war society, their canvases filled with distorted figures, moral decay, and the alienation of modern man. In architecture, Walter Gropius and the Bauhaus School dreamed of buildings that combined art and function, beauty and industry. They wanted to rebuild Germany not just with bricks, but with ideas. Berlin became the beating heart of this new world. The city was wild, alive, and shockingly modern. Jazz clubs, cabarets, and smoky theaters filled the nights. Men in tuxedos danced with women in feathered hats, while artists debated philosophy over strong coffee and cigarettes. For the first time, gender and sexuality were openly explored. Berlin was home to one of the earliest LGBTQ+ scenes in the world, with bars, publications, and performers defying social norms. It was liberation and chaos intertwined, a bold experiment in what freedom could look like. But freedom came at a cost. While artists and intellectuals thrived, many ordinary Germans were struggling to survive. The hyperinflation crisis of 1923 had wiped out entire savings accounts. Families that had once lived comfortably were now selling heirlooms just to buy food. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark before the war could now cost billions. It's hard to grasp what that does to a society. When your currency becomes meaningless, so does your faith in order and truth. For many, democracy became synonymous with instability, and yet, somehow Weimar survived. The introduction of a new currency, The Rentenmark and the Dawes Plan of 1924 helped stabilize the economy. American loans poured in, and for a brief, shining moment, Germany entered what historians call the Golden Twenties. Streets were cleaner, businesses reopened, and optimism returned. People started to believe that maybe, just maybe, Germany could find its place again in the modern world. This was the era when Marlene Dietrich began her rise to fame, when Fritz Lang directed Metropolis, and when Einstein's theories turned Berlin into a global center of science. But beneath the optimism, cracks remained. The prosperity of Weimar Germany was built on fragile foundations, loans, not lasting growth. Unemployment was still high, especially outside big cities. Farmers were drowning in debt, small businesses were struggling, and resentment simmered among those who felt left behind by the new modern culture. Conservative voices grew louder, denouncing Berlin as a place of decadence and sin. They pointed to cabaret culture, to modern art, to women smoking in public, and said, "This is not the Germany we fought for." Politics reflected that divide. Coalition governments came and went with dizzying speed. The very democracy that was supposed to represent everyone ended up representing no one effectively. Extreme parties on both sides, the communists and the nationalists, began to gain ground by feeding off frustration. The middle ground, the core of democracy, was slowly eroding. In 1925, when Paul von Hindenburg, the aging war hero, was elected president, many saw it as a sign that the old Germany, the militaristic, imperial one, still lived on in the nation's soul. As the decade drew to a close, the Republic stood at a crossroads. The arts were flourishing, cities were booming, and diplomacy seemed stable. In 1926, Germany even joined the League of Nations, a sign of acceptance on the world stage. But the illusion of security was just that, an illusion. The global economy was fragile, and Germany's dependence on foreign investment was dangerous. Few could have imagined how quickly everything would unravel. In 1929, the Wall Street crash sent shockwaves across the world. In Germany, it was catastrophic. Factories shut down, banks collapsed, and unemployment soared to record levels. Millions lost their jobs within months. Desperation returned, and this time it felt even worse, because now people had tasted hope. They had seen what stability could look like, and losing it was unbearable. In the midst of this despair, the old resentments came roaring back. The anger toward Versailles, the fear of communism, the longing for strength, all of it mixed together in a storm of discontent. And into that storm stepped the man who had been quietly rebuilding his movement ever since his failed coup in Munich years before. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, were about to find their moment. The Weimar Republic remains one of history's most fascinating paradoxes. It was a time of dazzling creativity, but also deep instability, a period when Germany was freer than ever, yet fragile to the point of collapse. It showed the best of what a society could achieve when liberated, and the worst of what can happen when that freedom is allowed to crumble. The stage was set, the lights were dimming, and behind the scenes, a new script was being written, one that would soon lead the world into darkness once again. If you were living in Germany in the early 1920s, you probably wouldn't have thought much of the man who would one day dominate your country. He was just another angry veteran in a Munich beer hall, small in stature, loud in voice and filled with resentment. But history has a strange way of turning whispers into thunder. The rise of Adolf Hitler wasn't sudden. It was a slow, calculated climb, one that combined charisma, timing, and the desperation of a nation searching for direction. To understand Hitler's rise, you have to picture Germany after the collapse of the Weimar Republic's first attempt at stability. People were disillusioned with democracy, humiliated by defeat, and terrified of communism. They wanted strength, they wanted certainty, and above all, they wanted someone to blame for their suffering. Into that climate stepped a man who knew how to weaponize words better than anyone else of his time. Born in Austria in 1889, Hitler moved to Germany before World War I and served as a soldier during the conflict. Like millions of others, he experienced the trauma of war, the trenches, the gas attacks, the sense of purpose that vanished with the armistice. When Germany surrendered in 1918, Hitler was in a hospital recovering from a gas injury. The news of defeat hit him like a personal betrayal. From that moment, he devoted himself to politics, not as a statesman, but as a man on a mission to rewrite the story of Germany's humiliation. In 1919, he joined a tiny political organization in Munich called the German Workers' Party. It was one of dozens of nationalist, anti-communist groups formed in the chaotic aftermath of the war. But Hitler quickly stood out. He had a gift, an ability to speak with intensity that could hold an audience spellbound. When he talked about the betrayal of Germany, about restoring its honor, people listened. Within a year, he had taken over the party and renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, or Nazi Party for short. The early Nazi movement was small but loud. They used powerful symbols: the swastika, the raised arm salute, the uniforms, all designed to create identity and discipline. Meetings were theatrical, emotional events. Hitler didn't just deliver speeches, he performed them. His words fused rage and hope, painting a vision of a new Germany, purified, united, and strong again. To an audience crushed by inflation, unemployment, and chaos, it sounded intoxicating. In November 1923, Hitler tried to seize power in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. It was supposed to be a bold revolution, a march through Munich that would ignite a nationwide uprising. Instead, it ended in disaster. The police fired on the marchers. 16 Nazis were killed, and Hitler was arrested. But in a twist of fate, his failure made him famous. During his trial, he transformed the courtroom into a stage, portraying himself as a patriot fighting for his country's rebirth. The judges gave him a lenient sentence, just 9 months in prison, and he used that time to write Mein Kampf, My Struggle, his manifesto outlining his worldview. In it, Hitler combined nationalism, racial hierarchy, and the belief in an authoritarian state. He described his hatred of Jews, his obsession with racial purity, and his vision of a future empire that would dominate Europe. The book was dense, sometimes incoherent, but it became the ideological foundation of Nazism. Few took it seriously at the time. They should have. When Hitler was released in 1924, the Nazi Party was in disarray, but he had learned an important lesson. Power couldn't be taken by force. It had to be won through the system itself. Over the next few years, he rebuilt his movement patiently. The Nazis began to run in elections, organize rallies, and spread propaganda through newspapers, posters, and radio. Their message was simple. Germany had been betrayed by weak politicians, greedy financiers, and foreign powers. Only strong leadership could restore greatness. For a while, though, they struggled to gain real traction. The mid-1920s were years of relative prosperity in Germany. The economy recovered, people found jobs again, and extremist parties began to fade. But Hitler waited. He watched. And when the Great Depression hit in 1929, he pounced. The Depression was the turning point. Within months, millions of Germans lost their livelihoods. The middle class, the backbone of Weimar society, was destroyed. People who once trusted democracy now looked for saviors. Hitler offered answers that were simple, emotional, and absolute. He promised jobs, national pride, and unity. He blamed outsiders for every failure and declared himself the man who could make Germany strong again. The Nazis mastered the art of mass politics. Their rallies were choreographed spectacles, flags waving, music thundering, torches blazing. It wasn't just politics, it was theater. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels turned modern media into a weapon. Posters portrayed Hitler as a messianic figure, calm, decisive, a man of the people. The message was relentless. One people, one nation, one leader. By 1930, the Nazis were winning millions of the votes. 2 years later, they became the largest party in the German parliament, the Reichstag, but they still lacked a majority. The traditional conservative elites, industrialists, military leaders, and politicians underestimated Hitler. They thought they could use him, control him, tame his movement to their advantage. That miscalculation would change history. In January 1933, under immense political pressure, President Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Many saw it as a temporary compromise, a way to stabilize the government. Few realized they had just handed absolute power to a man who would dismantle democracy from within. Within months, that's exactly what he did. When the Reichstag building caught fire in February 1933, Hitler blamed it on communists and used it as an excuse to suspend civil liberties. The Enabling Act followed soon after, giving him the authority to rule by decree. Opposition parties were banned, trade unions dissolved, and dissent crushed. Germany was no longer a democracy. It had become a dictatorship. The transformation was swift and terrifying. The press was censored, the police were militarized, and the first concentration camps were opened for political opponents. Those who once laughed at the angry man in the beer hall now found themselves living under his rule. By the time President Hindenburg died in 1934, Hitler merged the roles of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer, the supreme leader of the German Reich. The rise of Adolf Hitler wasn't a sudden explosion. It was the slow, methodical corrosion of a society's confidence. One speech, one promise, one crisis at a time. He didn't seize power, he was handed it by a nation that had lost faith in itself. And once he had it, he would reshape Germany and the world in his image. To fully understand how Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party went from being a loud, fringe movement to the rulers of Germany, you have to examine one of the most consequential economic events of the 20th century, the Great Depression. It was not merely an economic collapse, it was a social, political, and cultural earthquake that reshaped entire nations. And for Germany, It created the perfect storm that allowed extremism to thrive. Germany in the late 1920s had begun to recover from the chaos of hyperinflation and the instability of the early Weimar years. Thanks to the Dawes Plan, which reorganized reparations payments and funneled American loans into German industry, the economy appeared to stabilize. Factories reopened, employment rose, and people once again believed in the possibility of a stable life. Berlin's nightlife and cultural scene flourished. Cafes buzzed with debate. The Bauhaus movement redefined architecture, music, literature, and theater thrived. But beneath the surface, Germany remained vulnerable. Its recovery was not organic. It was heavily reliant on foreign loans and confidence in international finance. And as soon as the global economy faltered, Germany would be one of the first to feel the shock waves. That shock came in 1929 when the Wall Street crash triggered the Great Depression. American banks, which had been propping up Germany's recovery, suddenly recalled their loans. German businesses collapsed and factories closed. Unemployment skyrocketed. By 1932, 6 million Germans, nearly a quarter of the workforce, were out of work. Families faced starvation. Farmers went bankrupt. Middle-class citizens watched decades of savings vanish overnight. For the first time, the promise of the Weimar Republic seemed like a cruel illusion. Economic despair breeds political despair, and despair breeds extremism. Germans who had once believed in democratic institutions now looked elsewhere for solutions. The moderate parties, Social Democrats, Center Party, and others, were unable to offer hope. Their policies seemed slow, ineffectual, and impotent in the face of mass unemployment. Meanwhile, the radical parties on both ends of the political spectrum surged. On the left, the communists promised a revolution to overthrow capitalism. On the right, the Nazis offered national revival, scapegoating, and a vision of unity and strength. The Nazi Party's rise during this period was strategic and deliberate. Hitler and his inner circle understood that economic desperation could be transformed into political power. They targeted groups who felt abandoned: the unemployed, the rural population, veterans, and the urban poor. They promised jobs through rearmament programs, infrastructure projects, and national projects that would restore Germany's pride. Their rhetoric was simple, repetitive, and emotionally charged. Germany had been betrayed, but it could be restored. Every failure, every crisis had a culprit, and that culprit was anyone who was not truly German in the Nazi definition. Propaganda played a critical role. Joseph Goebbels, who had risen to become Hitler's minister of propaganda, turned modern media into a weapon. Newspapers, posters, rallies, and the emerging medium of radio all broadcast the Nazi message continuously. Even during periods of relative economic calm, the Nazis maintained their presence. They created a sense of inevitability, a feeling that the party wasn't just an option, but a solution. And when the Depression hit, that carefully cultivated image became irresistible to millions. The Nazis also exploited fear. They portrayed communists and leftists as dangerous revolutionaries ready to destroy the nation. Every strike, every protest, every labor dispute was framed as evidence that the country could not survive without strong leadership. Simultaneously, they appealed to national pride. Germans had been humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, they said, and democracy had failed to restore Germany's dignity. Only the Nazi Party could correct the course, rebuild the army, and make Germany respected and feared once again. Electoral results reflected this shift. In the 1928 federal election, the Nazi Party received less than 3% of the vote, still marginal, but by 1930, after the Depression had taken hold, their share surged to nearly 18%, becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag. By July 1932, they were the largest, with over 37% of the vote. In just 4 years, a fringe extremist party had transformed into a dominant political force. The speed of this rise is astonishing, and it illustrates how fragile societies can be when faced with economic catastrophe. Yet, numbers alone don't tell the full story. The Nazis' success was also psychological. They offered certainty in a world that seemed chaotic, simple answers in a world of complexity, and a sense of belonging in a society where so many felt lost. Their rallies were electrifying: torchlight parades, music, speeches designed to elicit loyalty and emotion. For millions, voting for the Nazis wasn't just political, it was a declaration of identity and hope. The other political actors in Germany played a role in Hitler's rise, often unintentionally. Conservative elites, industrialists, military leaders, and traditional politicians feared the communists more than the Nazis. They thought they could manipulate Hitler, use him to stabilize the country, and then control him once in power. This miscalculation was catastrophic. They underestimated both his ambition and his ability to command loyalty. By the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. The Great Depression didn't cause Hitler, but it created the environment in which his ideology could thrive. Economic collapse, social despair, and political paralysis converged to make millions receptive to messages of anger, blame, and restoration. Hitler's genius, terrifying in hindsight, was his ability to exploit every fear, every resentment, and every hope, turning them into political momentum. Germany, in the throes of economic desperation, was ready to follow someone who promised a new order. By the early 1930s, Germany was at a tipping point. Millions unemployed, cities filled with despair, farmers bankrupt, and a middle class watching their future vanish. The Weimar Republic, already fragile, appeared incapable of action. And then, at the center of this storm, stood Hitler, patient, calculating, and ready. The Great Depression didn't just shape the economy, it reshaped German politics, society, and the very trajectory of history. Without it, the Nazi Party might have remained a minor political curiosity. With it, they became an unstoppable force. So when we think about how Hitler rose to power, remember this: it wasn't magic, it wasn't luck, it was a combination of timing, strategy, and the vulnerabilities of a society under immense stress. The Great Depression was the fuel, and Hitler's ideology was the spark. Together, they would ignite a catastrophe that the world would remember for generations. By the time Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor in January 1933, Germany was a nation teetering on the edge. Millions were unemployed, the middle class was demoralized, and extremist ideologies had seeped into almost every corner of society. Yet, the idea that a single man could consolidate power so completely and so quickly might still have seemed unimaginable until you look closely at what happened next. The transformation of Germany from a fragile democracy into a totalitarian dictatorship was rapid, methodical, and chillingly effective. Hitler's first move was to exploit fear and uncertainty. Barely a month after his appointment, the Reichstag, Germany's parliament, building burned down in February 1933. The fire was dramatic, almost theatrical, and Hitler immediately blamed communists for the crime. Whether the fire was a coincidence, the act of a lone arsonist, or a plot by the Nazis themselves remains debated by historians, but Hitler used it masterfully. In the wake of the fire, he persuaded President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag Fire Decree, which suspended key civil liberties, including freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and privacy in communications. Suddenly, the state had the legal authority to arrest political opponents without due process. The Nazis didn't waste time. Police raids, mass arrests, and intimidation campaigns became standard tools. Communists, socialists, trade union leaders, and other perceived enemies were arrested or silenced. The first concentration camps, including Dachau, were established to house political prisoners. These camps would later become central to the Holocaust, but in the early years, they were used primarily to eliminate dissent and instill fear. People learned quickly opposition was not only risky, it could be fatal. Simultaneously, the Nazis moved to dismantle the democratic system itself. In March 1933, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, giving Hitler the authority to enact laws without parliamentary approval. In other words, he could rule by decree. The law was technically passed within legal frameworks, but it marked the end of democracy in Germany. Opposition parties were coerced, threatened, or simply banned. By mid-1933, the Social Democrats, Communists, and other non-Nazi parties had disappeared from the political landscape. Germany was now, in legal terms, a one-party state, but legal authority was only part of the strategy. The Nazis were equally effective in controlling society through propaganda and indoctrination. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, understood that winning hearts and minds was just as important as controlling laws. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, posters, and mass rallies all reinforced the Nazi message. Education was reshaped to glorify the state, racial purity, and the Führer. Youth organizations like the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls ensured that the next generation absorbed Nazi ideology as a core part of their identity. By controlling the narrative, the Nazis made dissent not only illegal, but culturally and socially dangerous. Another key element of this transformation was the purging of institutions that might resist Nazi control. The judiciary, previously an independent branch of government, was brought under state influence. Judges were expected to support Nazi ideology, and courts were often used as tools of intimidation rather than justice. Civil service workers were required to swear loyalty to the regime, and anyone considered politically unreliable was removed. Universities, churches, and professional organizations were pressured to conform or face marginalization. Over time, nearly every aspect of public and private life fell under the shadow of the dictatorship. Economics also played a role in consolidating power. Hitler and his advisors recognized that social unrest was often rooted in poverty and unemployment. They launched massive public works programs, built the Autobahn, and promoted industrial rearmament. By the mid-1930s, unemployment had dramatically decreased. Factories were humming again, and many ordinary Germans felt a renewed sense of purpose and pride. The perception of success created loyalty. Even if people had doubts about the regime's ideology, they often supported it because it seemed to work. An illusion of stability under a tight authoritarian grip. The Nazis also manipulated the legal and political system to secure their dominance. They centralized power in the Chancellor's office and eliminated the Länder, Germany's regional governments, as independent authorities. Governors and administrators were appointed directly by the regime. By controlling both national and local government, Hitler ensured there was no counterbalance. Police forces were reorganized, and paramilitary groups like the SS and SA enforced the state's will on the streets. Fear, compliance, and loyalty became intertwined in the very structure of society. Internationally, Hitler's Germany appeared confident and unchallenged. Many foreign leaders underestimated the speed and ambition of the new regime. They believed that Hitler could be contained or that his policies were temporary. Meanwhile, domestically, the average German encountered a seamless, totalitarian reality. Media glorifying the Führer, public events reinforcing obedience, and neighborhoods subtly monitored for dissent. The line between personal and political life disappeared. The transformation into a dictatorship also relied on psychological tools. Rituals, symbolism, and spectacle were crucial. Mass rallies, parades, and military-style marches created a sense of belonging and purpose. Symbols like the swastika and salutes were omnipresent. The Nazis understood that power was not just about laws and enforcement. It was about perception, emotion, and culture. By the time Hitler had consolidated control, the people not only obeyed him, but in many cases, revered him. Obedience became internalized, not just imposed externally. The speed of this transformation is staggering. Within a year of becoming chancellor, Hitler had dismantled democratic institutions, neutralized political opposition, centralized the state, and reshaped culture. What took decades to build, democracy, freedom, pluralism, had been destroyed in months, and the world, for the most part, was watching, but did not yet intervene. It is important to understand that this transformation did not happen solely through terror or coercion. It was also achieved through persuasion, promises, and social engineering. Germans were offered hope in a time of desperation, jobs in a time of unemployment, and pride in a time of humiliation. The dictatorship succeeded not just because of fear, but because it convinced millions that it was delivering something they deeply desired: stability, order, and national revival. By mid-1934, after the Night of the Long Knives, a brutal purge of the SA leadership and other potential rivals, Hitler's power was absolute. No political, military, or social entity could challenge him without facing annihilation. Germany had become a totalitarian state, one of the most efficient and oppressive dictatorships in history. The machinery of control was complete. Legal authority, propaganda, culture, police, education, and fear all worked in unison. Resistance was almost impossible, and the foundation for the horrors to come had been firmly established. The transformation of Germany into a dictatorship demonstrates how quickly democracy can be dismantled when fear, economic crisis, and charismatic leadership converge. It is a stark reminder that freedom is fragile and that legal systems and institutions, no matter how sophisticated, can be manipulated if the conditions are right. In this period, Germany was no longer just a nation in crisis. It had become a nation under total control, with a leader whose vision would soon plunge the world into the most devastating conflict in human history. One of the most fascinating and terrifying aspects of Nazi Germany was not just the political takeover, but how the regime controlled nearly every aspect of information, culture, and even thought itself. To understand the power of Adolf Hitler's dictatorship, you need to understand propaganda, not as a simple tool, but as a carefully engineered system designed to shape perception, manipulate emotions, and ensure total obedience. And in Germany, propaganda didn't just inform, it transformed reality. At the heart of this operation was Joseph Goebbels, appointed Minister of Propaganda in 1933. Goebbels was a master of modern media long before the term existed. He understood that control over what people see, hear, and read can mold the very way they think. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, posters, films, and public speeches were all orchestrated to project a consistent, compelling image of the Nazi state. Every piece of media reinforced the idea that Hitler was Germany's savior, that the nation was under threat, and that loyalty to the state was the highest virtue. Take radio, for instance. Goebbels recognized the power of the radio in a country still recovering from economic collapse. Affordable radios were manufactured and widely distributed, allowing Hitler's speeches to reach millions of homes. Families would gather around their devices to listen, and in doing so, absorb the Nazi worldview repeatedly and systematically. It wasn't just news, it was a carefully crafted narrative designed to feel personal, urgent, and inescapable. Print media was similarly controlled. Independent newspapers were either shut down, censored, or absorbed into state-run publications. Editors and journalists were expected to toe the line. Dissenting voices were silenced or persecuted. Propaganda posters were everywhere, on streets, in offices, and even in schools. The imagery was powerful. Heroic soldiers, smiling workers, idealized families, and symbols of the Reich. Swastikas appeared in public spaces like flags in a stadium, a constant visual reminder that the state was omnipresent. Cinema became another weapon of influence. The Nazis understood that film could stir emotions and make abstract ideas tangible. Documentaries, newsreels, and feature films glorified the regime while vilifying its enemies. Even movies, meant purely for entertainment, carried ideological undertones. Watching a film was not merely a pastime, it was participation in the collective imagination the Nazis were constructing. Art and entertainment became vehicles for political indoctrination, making ideology a part of everyday life without overt coercion. Education and youth programs were critical to this propaganda system. Schools no longer offered neutral instruction. Curriculums were rewritten to glorify German history, emphasize racial hierarchy, and instill unwavering loyalty to Hitler. Teachers were vetted for political reliability, and students were enrolled in Hitler Youth and League of German Girls programs. These organizations were more than clubs. They were immersive experiences. Children practiced military drills, learned Nazi ideology, and internalized the party's worldview through games, songs, and communal rituals. By targeting youth, the regime ensured that the next generation was fully integrated into its vision of society. Propaganda didn't stop at positive messaging. It also worked through fear. Enemies of the state, whether real or imagined, were portrayed as dangerous, subhuman, or conspiratorial. Jews, communists, and political dissidents were not only blamed for economic problems and national humiliation, but were also systematically dehumanized. Anti Semitic cartoons, films, and publications created a sense of existential threat. By portraying opponents as enemies of the nation, the regime justified harsh measures, persecution, and eventually genocide, while rallying popular support for these actions. Even architecture and public events were used as tools of control. Nuremberg rallies, grandiose parades, and massive speeches were designed to impress, intimidate, and unify. They weren't just displays of power, they were immersive experiences, creating a sense of participation in something monumental. The sheer scale, symmetry, and spectacle of these events made individuals feel both small and part of a larger, unstoppable collective. The Nazis understood psychology. When people feel both awe and belonging, obedience becomes almost natural. Control extended to the daily rhythms of life. Music, theater, literature, and even sports were co-opted to reinforce Nazi ideals. Degenerate art, anything modernist, abstract, or avant-garde, was banned, ridiculed, and removed from galleries. Popular music was censored to promote German folk songs, marches, and compositions aligning with nationalist ideals. Cultural conformity wasn't just legal or political, it became social. People who deviated risked ostracism, career loss, or worse. Surveillance was everywhere, from neighbors reporting dissent to secret police keeping tabs on suspected enemies. Propaganda and control worked together, creating a reality where compliance was easier than defiance. Another crucial aspect was repetition. The Nazis understood that persistent, repeated messaging created acceptance. Repetition turned lies into truth and manufactured consent. Every speech, broadcast, or poster reinforced the same themes. Germany was a nation under threat. Hitler was the savior. Enemies were dangerous. And obedience was honorable. Over time, even skeptics found themselves absorbing the ideology, consciously or unconsciously. Propaganda became not just instruction, but reality itself. What's remarkable and frightening is how effective this system was without relying solely on brute force. Fear, yes, was present, but much of the population followed willingly because the propaganda made them believe in the promises, the identity, and the vision offered by the regime. This combination of emotional manipulation, social conformity, and psychological engineering created one of the most complete totalitarian systems in history. By controlling information, shaping perceptions, and influencing daily life, Nazi propaganda transformed Germany. It created a society where dissent was dangerous, obedience was rewarded, and ideology became a lived experience. The people didn't just obey the state, they often internalized its values, seeing Hitler not only as a leader, but as the embodiment of Germany's destiny. This wasn't magic, it was systematic, strategic, and chillingly effective. Understanding propaganda and control in Nazi Germany is essential because it shows how power can extend beyond armies and laws. It operates in minds, perceptions, and emotions. The Nazis didn't just conquer territory, they conquered reality, turning information into a weapon and ordinary citizens into participants in a system that would reshape the world. One of the most decisive and audacious steps in Adolf Hitler's consolidation of power was the remilitarization of Germany. To fully understand this, you have to remember that for 15 years following World War I, the Treaty of Versailles had intentionally crippled the German military. The army was limited to 100,000 men. Conscription was banned. Tanks and heavy artillery were forbidden, and the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, was non-existent. Submarines, warships, and advanced weapons development were prohibited. Germany had been deliberately disarmed to prevent it from waging another war. Yet, by the mid-1930s, all of these restrictions were quietly, systematically, and then publicly violated with shocking speed and precision. Hitler understood that a strong military was central not only to national pride, but to his political agenda. The military represented power, unity, and the potential for territorial expansion, key elements of the Nazi vision. The process of rebuilding began subtly with secret programs in the early 1930s. The army and Nazi officials collaborated to develop weapons and train personnel in violation of Versailles. Civilian programs, ostensibly aimed at infrastructure, were designed to prepare a population for militarization. By blending legality with deception, Hitler avoided immediate international backlash while steadily preparing Germany for conflict. The first major public step came in 1935, when Hitler openly announced the reintroduction of conscription and the creation of the Luftwaffe. Suddenly, Germany was no longer bound by Versailles. Soldiers marched in uniform, planes took to the skies, and naval programs restarted. This bold defiance sent shockwaves through Europe. France and Britain protested, but their response was limited. The League of Nations, still fragile and ineffective, offered only weak condemnation. Hitler had calculated perfectly. He had broken the rules, tested the international response, and found that the world's reaction was slow, hesitant, and indecisive. The rebuilding of the military was more than just numbers. It was also about ideology. Military culture under the Nazis was deeply intertwined with nationalist and racial ideas. Soldiers were not merely defenders of the state, they were instruments of a vision of racial destiny. Officer training emphasized loyalty to the Führer above all else. Military education incorporated political indoctrination, stressing that obedience to Hitler was obedience to Germany itself. This created a military force that was highly disciplined, fanatically loyal, and fully aligned with Nazi objectives, a combination that would become both terrifying and historically consequential. Economic policy supported this military expansion. Germany's industrial sector, particularly the arms industry, was revitalized. Factories that had struggled during the Depression now produced tanks, artillery, airplanes, and munitions at an unprecedented rate. Civil engineering projects, such as the Autobahn, served dual purposes, stimulating the economy and creating infrastructure that could support rapid troop movement in future military campaigns. The state coordinated industry, labor, and resources in a way that blurred the lines between civilian and military production. Every road, every factory, and every new aircraft became part of the larger military strategy. The German public largely supported these initiatives. After years of economic uncertainty and humiliation following World War I, the revival of the military was a source of national pride. Parades, military exercises, and air shows showcased Germany's resurgence. Ordinary citizens were encouraged to see the army not only as protection, but as a symbol of renewal. Hitler understood the psychology. A strong military gave people confidence in the regime, even if they were unaware of the full scope of his ambitions. The perception of strength became just as important as actual capability. The international response, known as appeasement, further emboldened Hitler. Many European powers were reluctant to confront Germany directly, still haunted by the memories of the First World War. Diplomatic negotiations, treaties, and conferences were often treated as procedural hurdles rather than real deterrents. Hitler's strategy was simple but effective. Push boundaries incrementally, observe reactions, and exploit hesitation. By the time nations realized the full extent of Germany's military buildup, it was too late to challenge him without risking conflict. The remilitarization also had political implications inside Germany. The Nazi Party gained enormous popularity. By presenting itself as the party of national revival, Hitler could claim credit for economic improvement, employment programs, and military resurgence simultaneously. Opponents, including conservatives and moderates, found it increasingly difficult to criticize a government that was delivering tangible results, even if the methods were authoritarian and dangerous. National pride, economic benefit, and fear of communism converged to consolidate support for the regime. By the late 1930s, Germany's military capabilities had reached a level that made European powers uneasy. The army had grown far beyond the limits set by Versailles. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, submarines were being secretly produced, and new tanks and artillery filled depots. Germany was no longer a nation recovering from defeat. It was a nation preparing for expansion, and Hitler knew it. The rebuilding of the military wasn't an abstract political move. It was a carefully orchestrated preparation for war, combined with a domestic narrative of strength and unity that few dared to oppose. The remilitarization of Germany illustrates the effectiveness of strategic patience combined with bold action. Hitler didn't simply violate treaties recklessly, he measured the world's responses, exploited hesitation, and built both capability and public support. He used infrastructure, economy, and ideology as part of a larger military strategy. By the time the world fully understood the scale of Germany's rearmament, Hitler had created a disciplined, loyal, and formidable military machine, one capable of executing rapid, coordinated operations across Europe. This transformation wasn't just a story of tanks, planes, and soldiers. It was a story of psychological preparation, societal conditioning, and political calculation. The German military became not only a tool of conquest, but also a symbol of the regime's power and the nation's resurgence. Rebuilding the military allowed Hitler to present the illusion of national pride and renewal, while simultaneously preparing for the aggression that would plunge Europe into the deadliest war in human history. When we think of Hitler's rise to power, it's easy to focus on propaganda, terror, and military expansion. But one of the most effective tools the Nazi regime used was to solidify its grip on Germany was something much subtler: the economy. In a nation reeling from the Great Depression, where unemployment had reached astronomical levels, the promise of jobs, stability, and prosperity was almost irresistible. Economic policy became a central pillar of Hitler's strategy, and it worked on multiple levels: practical, psychological, and political. To understand the impact, let's rewind a bit. By the early 1930s, Germany was in free fall. Banks were failing, factories were idle, and millions of people were unemployed. Families who had once been middle class were now scraping by. Farmers defaulted on loans. Cities swelled with the unemployed. Streets were filled with breadlines, and despair hung over the nation like a fog. The Weimar Republic had tried to stabilize things through limited social programs and appeals to foreign lenders. But the Great Depression had destroyed those fragile foundations. When Hitler came to power, the German people were desperate for action. The first and most visible element of Nazi economic policy was public works programs. The government launched massive infrastructure projects that were designed to create jobs while also building what would later serve military purposes. Perhaps the most famous of these was the Autobahn, Germany's national highway system. Not only did the project employ tens of thousands of workers, but it also served strategic, military, and logistical purposes. Bridges, roads, and transportation networks were built under the guise of economic development, but were designed to support rapid troop movement for future campaigns. In addition to public works, the Nazis promoted industrial revitalization. Factory production increased as the regime invested heavily in rearmament. While the world saw Germany's economic recovery as a curious phenomenon, it was intimately tied to military buildup. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, and munitions were produced at unprecedented rates, providing employment while simultaneously strengthening the nation's future military capacity. Every factory job was framed as both a personal benefit and a patriotic duty, making economic activity a tool of loyalty and identity as much as income. Another critical component was the focus on self-sufficiency, or autarky. Hitler wanted Germany to rely as little as possible on foreign imports, both to protect against economic blockades and to prepare for war. This meant investing in synthetic fuels, rubber alternatives, and agricultural modernization. Farmers received subsidies and were encouraged to increase production. Corporations were brought into alignment with state priorities. Even consumption patterns were influenced to favor industries deemed critical to national strength. The economy wasn't just being fixed, it was being militarized, industrialized, and aligned with ideological goals. The labor system itself was transformed. Independent trade unions were abolished and replaced with the German Labor Front, Deutsche Arbeitsfront, which controlled wages, working conditions, and workers' leisure activities. On the surface, this appeared to bring order and stability to a chaotic labor market. Strikes were banned, but employment was guaranteed. Workers were encouraged to take part in state-sponsored leisure programs and cultural events. By merging economic policy with social programming, the regime created the impression that life under Nazi rule was orderly, predictable, and beneficial. These policies had a profound psychological effect. Unemployment dropped dramatically. By 1936, millions who had been jobless were now employed, and the streets of German cities were filled with workers returning to factories, construction sites, and farms. People could pay rent, buy food, and plan for the future, all of which created loyalty to the regime. Economic recovery was not just a policy success, it was a propaganda tool. Every visible sign of prosperity reinforced the message that Hitler had restored Germany's strength and dignity. At the same time, this economic revival was carefully controlled and manipulated. The government dictated industrial priorities, influenced wages, and controlled access to credit. Private enterprise existed, but only within the framework the Nazis established. Businesses that resisted were marginalized or taken over. By combining central planning, industrial cooperation, and propaganda, the regime created a system where economic activity served both national and ideological goals. Success was real, but it came at the cost of freedom, choice, and long-term sustainability. Another critical factor was militarization as economic policy. Military production was deliberately designed to stimulate employment and industrial growth. Civilian infrastructure projects had dual purposes, as we've seen, preparing Germany for rapid mobilization. This strategy reinforced the sense that work, employment, and economic participation were inherently patriotic. Ordinary Germans became part of a vast, nationalized effort to restore Germany to power, and this sense of purpose strengthened loyalty to the regime. It's important to note that the benefits of these policies were uneven. Women were often pushed out of the workforce to make room for men. Jews were systematically excluded from economic life, and political opponents were barred from participation. The economic miracle that the Nazis presented was, in reality, a highly selective process that reinforced the ideological hierarchies of the regime. Prosperity was offered, but only to those deemed worthy according to the state's racial and political standards. The combination of public works, industrial revitalization, labor control, and militarization produced striking results. By the late 1930s, unemployment had dropped to almost negligible levels. Industrial output had increased dramatically, and infrastructure had improved nationwide. Germany, which had once been paralyzed by depression, now appeared confident, disciplined, and productive. International observers were often impressed, though many failed to recognize the authoritarian and militaristic framework underpinning this apparent success. In effect, economic recovery under the Nazis wasn't just about numbers. It was about legitimacy, loyalty, and control. A government that could provide jobs, stability, and a sense of purpose earned not just obedience, but enthusiasm. Economic success became inseparable from political power. Millions of Germans, benefiting from employment and prosperity, became invested in the very regime that would later lead them into war and catastrophe. In this sense, economic policy was as powerful as propaganda and as critical as military expansion, a foundational pillar in the transformation of Germany into a totalitarian state. By the late 1930s, Germany was no longer a nation suffering from economic collapse. It was a nation marching forward under the dual forces of industrial revitalization and ideological conformity. Economic recovery had created confidence, loyalty, and a sense of destiny, a perfect storm for Hitler's larger ambitions. What the Nazis achieved in just a few years demonstrates the immense influence of policy, planning, and perception on society. By intertwining economic progress with propaganda and militarization, The regime made prosperity both a tool and a weapon. When exploring Nazi Germany, it's not enough to focus solely on politics, propaganda, or the economy. The regime's most profound impact was on everyday life, on how people lived, what they believed, and even how they thought about family, work, and society itself. Social policies under the Nazis were designed not just to control citizens, but to reshape the very fabric of German identity. This was social engineering on an unprecedented scale, blending ideology, psychology, and public policy into a single, all-encompassing system. At the heart of this vision was the idea of racial hierarchy. The Nazis believed that the Aryan German was a master race, biologically superior and destined to rule. This belief permeated every aspect of society. Schools taught children about racial purity, physical fitness, and loyalty to the state. Universities and scientific institutions were co-opted to justify racial theories, and laws were enacted to enforce separation and prevent undesirable populations from integrating into German life. Marriage and family policies encouraged racially pure Germans to have children, while Jews, Romani people, and others were increasingly marginalized and eventually persecuted. Women played a unique role in this social vision. Nazi ideology emphasized traditional gender roles. Women were celebrated as mothers, caregivers, and bearers of the nation's future. The state encouraged marriage and childbirth through incentives such as marriage loans, awards for large families, and public honors for mothers with multiple children. At the same time, women were discouraged from entering the workforce, particularly in professions considered critical to men's employment or military readiness. Education for girls focused on domestic skills and child rearing, while physical fitness programs emphasized health and endurance. Women's social identity became closely tied to family, reproduction, and service to the nation. Youth were central to the Nazis' long-term social plan. Organizations like the Hitler Youth for Boys and the League of German Girls for Girls ensured that children were immersed in the ideology from a young age. These groups were not just extracurricular, they were immersive experiences designed to indoctrinate, socialize, and train the next generation of loyal citizens. Activities included physical training, paramilitary drills, ideological lessons, and community service. Participation was compulsory by the late 1930s, ensuring that nearly every young German was exposed to Nazi values, creating a generation that internalized loyalty and obedience as natural norms. Education itself was reshaped to serve the state. Textbooks were rewritten to emphasize German history, racial theory, and loyalty to the Führer. Subjects like biology were used to teach racial hierarchies, while history and literature stressed the greatness of Germany and the dangers of enemies, both internal and external. Critical thinking, at least in the political sense, was discouraged. Instead, students were taught to accept the state's narrative as truth and to view themselves as part of a larger collective mission. Education became a tool of both intellectual and moral conditioning. Cultural life, too, was tightly controlled. The Nazis believed that art, literature, and music should serve the state and the ideology. Degenerate art, anything abstract, modernist, or challenging to traditional norms, was banned and often publicly ridiculed. Museums, theaters, and concert halls were purged of works considered subversive. Simultaneously, art that glorified the state, rural life, heroic soldiers, and Aryan ideals was promoted. The regime understood the power of culture to shape values, identity, and loyalty, and it wielded this power deliberately and ruthlessly. Even leisure and social activity were incorporated into the system. The Nazis organized mass rallies, sporting events, and community programs to reinforce unity and conformity. Organizations like the Strength Through Joy program, Kraft durch Freude, offered vacations, entertainment, and social events to workers, creating the sense that the regime cared for citizens' well-being. Yet these programs also subtly reinforced obedience and national identity, blending pleasure with indoctrination. Citizens were entertained, but in a carefully controlled, politically aligned environment. Religion, while not completely eradicated, was also managed. The Nazis promoted a version of Christianity that was compatible with state ideology, while discouraging dissenting religious groups. Clergy, who opposed the regime, faced intimidation, arrest, or removal from office. Churches were pressured to teach loyalty to the state, and religious holidays were sometimes reframed to align with nationalistic themes. In essence, the Nazis sought to integrate spiritual life into the broader project of ideological conformity. Social engineering extended into public health and eugenics. The regime encouraged fitness, hygiene, and medical interventions designed to maintain the population's racial quality. Programs included anti-smoking campaigns, athletic competitions, and medical screenings. Conversely, those deemed unfit, the disabled, chronically ill, or mentally challenged were increasingly marginalized and subjected to forced sterilization. This chilling aspect of social policy reflected the regime's obsession with control, purity, and efficiency in shaping the nation. Importantly, all these policies worked together in a coordinated system. Economic incentives reinforced social goals. Families had more children, workers participated in state programs, and citizens saw tangible benefits for loyalty and conformity. Propaganda amplified these messages, making social ideals appear aspirational and desirable. Fear of punishment, combined with social pressure and indoctrination, ensured compliance. In this way, the Nazi vision of society was not imposed solely through coercion. It was normalized, internalized, and celebrated by many who participated. By the late 1930s, Germany was a nation where social life, family, education, culture, and leisure were all aligned with the state's ideological vision. Citizens were constantly exposed to messaging reinforcing racial hierarchy, national pride, and loyalty to Hitler. The regime had effectively reshaped society, creating a population that was disciplined, motivated, and largely compliant, a society where dissent was both dangerous and psychologically difficult. The social policies of Nazi Germany demonstrate the profound impact of ideology on daily life. By intertwining education, youth programs, family incentives, culture, and leisure, the regime didn't just rule citizens, it shaped how they thought, acted, and imagined their place in the world. Social control became as important as political or military control, and the consequences of this totalitarian social engineering would be felt not just in the years of the Third Reich, but for generations to come. One of the darkest and most significant aspects of Nazi Germany was the systematic persecution of Jews. This wasn't an accidental consequence of their rise to power. It was a central pillar of Nazi ideology and a deliberate, escalating policy that would ultimately lead to the Holocaust. Understanding this process is critical because it shows how prejudice, propaganda, and law can combine to create both societal complicity and catastrophic violence. Anti-Semitism in Germany did not begin with Hitler, but he weaponized it like no one before him. Jews were scapegoated for Germany's defeat in World War I, the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, and the economic crises that followed, including hyperinflation and the Great Depression. Hitler and his propaganda machine portrayed Jews as both morally corrupt and politically dangerous, linking them to communism, capitalism, and other perceived threats. This created an image of Jews as a constant and insidious threat to German society, a narrative repeated relentlessly in media, education, and political rhetoric. The Nazis translated ideology into law with frightening efficiency. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 formalized racial discrimination against Jews. These laws defined who was considered Jewish, prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews, and stripped Jews of German citizenship. In one legal stroke, millions of people were rendered second-class citizens, denied basic rights, and segregated from the broader society. Schools, public services, and professional institutions became increasingly restricted for Jewish citizens, isolating them socially, economically, and politically. Discrimination extended far beyond legal restrictions. Jews were expelled from schools, universities, government positions, and civil service roles. Businesses were forced to sell or close. Professional licenses were revoked, and participation in public life was curtailed. The goal was not only to marginalize Jews, but to systematically remove their presence from German society. Propaganda reinforced these measures, depicting Jews as enemies of the state, dangerous to social cohesion, and inherently untrustworthy. The combination of law and messaging created a climate of fear, resentment, and compliance among the broader population. Violence was also a central tool of persecution. One of the most infamous events was Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, in November 1938. Across Germany and Austria, synagogues were burned, Jewish businesses destroyed, homes ransacked, and thousands of Jews arrested and sent to concentration camps. It was both a symbolic and practical escalation. The message was clear that Jews were targets of state-sanctioned violence. Ordinary citizens witnessed, and in some cases participated in, acts of terror, further normalizing anti-Semitism and creating a society in which persecution was accepted, ignored, or even supported. Social and economic exclusion became more pronounced in the late 1930s. Jews were barred from owning property, working in certain industries, or traveling freely. Schools segregated Jewish children, and public spaces, like parks, theaters, and restaurants, were off limits. The Nazis created a system where Jews were physically present in Germany, but increasingly invisible in social, professional, and cultural life. This isolation laid the groundwork for the later stages of mass deportation and genocide. Propaganda intensified the demonization of Jews. Cartoons, newspapers, and films portrayed them as subhuman, corrupt, or dangerous. Children in schools were taught to view Jews as enemies. This relentless messaging not only justified legal and economic restrictions, but also fostered societal acceptance, or at least passive complicity, in persecution. Ordinary Germans were exposed daily to a narrative that dehumanized their neighbors, co-workers, and even friends. Importantly, the persecution of Jews was part of a broader pattern of targeting those deemed undesirable by the regime, political opponents, Romani people, the disabled, and others were subjected to discrimination, forced sterilization, or incarceration. The Nazis combined law, propaganda, and social pressure to create a system in which exclusion and violence were normalized. Jews, however, were central to this ideological campaign, singled out for systematic marginalization, humiliation, and eventual annihilation. By the outbreak of World War II, anti-Semitic policies had escalated dramatically. Jews were forced into ghettos in occupied territories, subjected to forced labor, and stripped of personal autonomy. The machinery of the state, from police to bureaucrats to local administrators, was mobilized to enforce these policies. What had begun as social and legal exclusion now became a logistical and administrative system for controlling and ultimately destroying a population. Every step of persecution, law, propaganda, and violence was carefully coordinated to isolate and dehumanize Jews before the most extreme measures were implemented. It's critical to recognize how deeply societal complicity was woven into this process. Many ordinary Germans benefited from the exclusion of Jews. Property was confiscated, businesses were redistributed, and jobs opened up. Fear, propaganda, and social pressure silenced dissent. The Nazis relied on a combination of intimidation, ideology, and incentives to ensure that ordinary citizens either participated or turned a blind eye. This societal alignment was a key factor in the unprecedented scale of persecution that would follow. By the early 1940s, anti-Semitic policies had reached their most extreme stages. Jews were deported from Germany to ghettos and later to extermination camps in occupied Eastern Europe. The Holocaust, the systematic, industrialized murder of 6 million Jews, was the culmination of years of legal discrimination, social isolation, and state propaganda. What began as prejudice had been transformed into a machine of mass killing, illustrating how ideology, bureaucracy, and societal complicity can combine to create unimaginable atrocities. The persecution of Jews in Nazi Germany is a chilling lesson in how a society can be manipulated through law, propaganda, and fear. It demonstrates the consequences of unchecked hatred combined with authoritarian power. The policies were methodical, deliberate, and escalatory, designed to strip people of rights, dignity, and ultimately, life. By understanding this process, we see not only the horrors of the Holocaust, but also the mechanisms through which totalitarian regimes can control populations, normalize exclusion, and carry out crimes on an unimaginable scale. In studying this period, it's essential to remember that these events did not occur in a vacuum. They were part of a broader system of control, propaganda, and ideology that permeated every aspect of German life. Anti-Semitism was central to the Nazi vision of society, and its implementation demonstrates how ideas, once politically weaponized, can translate into systemic violence. It's a sobering reminder of the power of ideology, the fragility of rights, and the responsibilities of society to resist hate in all its forms. By the mid-1930s, Hitler had transformed Germany into a highly disciplined, militarized, and ideologically unified state. But his ambitions extended far beyond borders or domestic control. The Nazi regime had a clear vision of expansion, a quest for Lebensraum, or living space, which meant conquering territories to the east, subjugating populations, and establishing Germany as the dominant power in Europe. Understanding this road to war requires examining both Hitler's ideological motivations and the strategic steps he took to implement them. From the start, Hitler's foreign policy was grounded in a belief in German exceptionalism and destiny. He rejected the post-World War I international order, particularly the Treaty of Versailles, which he viewed as humiliating and unjust. The treaty had imposed territorial losses, disarmament, and reparations on Germany. For Hitler, these were not merely legal restrictions. They were an affront to the German nation and people. His goal was to overturn Versailles completely, restore Germany's strength, and expand its territory to achieve geopolitical dominance. The first moves were both symbolic and strategic. In 1935, Hitler reintroduced conscription, openly violating Versailles, and rebuilt the Luftwaffe. This militarization signaled that Germany would no longer adhere to imposed limits. In 1936, German troops entered the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone according to the treaty. The move was risky. The French army was capable of countering through advance, yet Hitler gambled that France and Britain would avoid confrontation. They did, choosing appeasement over conflict. Hitler had successfully tested the limits of European tolerance, demonstrating that aggressive action could be undertaken with minimal resistance. Hitler's approach was both incremental and calculated. Rather than launching a massive invasion immediately, he pursued a series of smaller steps, each designed to consolidate power and expand influence. The annexation of Austria in 1938, known as the Anschluss, was a major milestone. Germany absorbed Austria without significant military opposition, presenting the takeover as a reunification rather than aggression. The success emboldened Hitler and reinforced the strategy that incremental expansion, coupled with propaganda and political pressure, could achieve dramatic results without triggering war, at least initially. The Sudetenland crisis, later in 1938, further illustrates this approach. Hitler demanded that Czechoslovakia cede the Sudetenland, a region with a significant ethnic German population. European powers, particularly Britain and France, sought to avoid war and agreed to the Munich Agreement, allowing Germany to annex the territory. Hitler publicly promised that this would be his last territorial demand, a promise made to appear diplomatic, yet in reality, it was part of a larger plan. This moment marked the peak of appeasement, showing Hitler that the Allies were unwilling or unable to confront him directly, and setting the stage for more aggressive expansion. Hitler's foreign policy was guided by ideology as much as strategy. He believed in racial hierarchy and the need for Lebensraum, envisioning conquest of Eastern Europe, displacement or extermination of inferior populations, and settlement by Germans. This ideology was intertwined with military planning, economic considerations, and propaganda. Conquest was not simply about territory, it was about reshaping Europe according to Nazi racial and political ideals. Foreign policy and ideological objectives were inseparable. Diplomacy was a tool, but always a subordinate one. Hitler used treaties, agreements, and negotiations to buy time, legitimize actions, and exploit divisions among other nations. For example, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union in 1939, a non-aggression treaty, allowed Germany to invade Poland without fear of immediate Soviet intervention. Behind the scenes, Hitler never intended to honor the pact long term. It was a tactical maneuver, highlighting his preference for calculated deception in achieving strategic goals. By 1939, Hitler's preparations had reached a critical stage. Germany's military had expanded, its economy had been mobilized for war, and society had been fully indoctrinated with nationalist and militaristic ideology. Diplomacy had revealed the limits of European resolve. Hitler had positioned Germany to strike decisively. In September 1939, the invasion of Poland marked the culmination of years of preparation, aggression, and incremental territorial expansion. This act triggered the outbreak of World War II, as Britain and France declared war in response. The road to war had been carefully paved through ideology, opportunism, and strategic calculation. The aggressive foreign policy was also deeply intertwined with domestic politics. Each act of expansion strengthened Hitler's image as the savior of Germany, reinforcing national pride and loyalty. Citizens celebrated the annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland as victories, enhancing the legitimacy of the regime. Economic gains, military glory, and propaganda combined to create a sense of inevitability that Germany was destined to rise again, and that Hitler's leadership was essential for this resurgence. It's important to recognize that the road to war was deliberate and methodical. Hitler did not act impulsively. He exploited crises, assessed the reactions of other nations, and escalated tensions incrementally. Appeasement by Britain and France, combined with domestic economic and social stabilization, created the conditions for unchecked aggression. Hitler's foreign policy demonstrates how ideological objectives, strategic calculation, and opportunism can converge to produce large-scale conflict. Finally, Hitler's vision of war was total and transformative. He did not merely seek military conquest, he sought to remake Europe according to Nazi principles. Expansion was linked to racial policy, economic exploitation, and political domination. Each territorial gain was framed as a historical and moral imperative, not merely a political or military decision. This worldview made compromise impossible, escalation inevitable, and global conflict almost certain. In retrospect, the road to war shows how ideology, planning, and opportunism can combine to transform a regional crisis into a world-shattering conflict. Hitler's aggressive foreign policy was a product of careful preparation, incremental action, and a ruthless understanding of international dynamics. Germany's rearmament, economic recovery, and domestic indoctrination all fed into this expansionist vision. By the time the first shots were fired in September 1939, the world was facing a war that had been years in the making. A war rooted in ideology, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of power. By the outbreak of World War II, Germany was no longer a nation recovering from economic depression or political chaos. It was a machine of military efficiency, strategic planning, and ideological conviction. Central to Germany's early victories in the war was a concept that revolutionized modern warfare, Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This strategy, combining speed, coordination, and shock, allowed Germany to overwhelm enemies before they could respond effectively, reshaping both the battlefield and the psychology of war. Blitzkrieg wasn't just a tactic, it was a philosophy of movement and decisiveness. It relied on rapid, coordinated attacks using tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and air power in tight synchronization instead of prolonged trench warfare, where armies were locked in attrition. Blitzkrieg sought to break enemy lines quickly, penetrate deep into territory, and create chaos behind enemy defenses. The strategy emphasized mobility, surprise, and concentrated force, aiming to paralyze opponents both physically and psychologically. In essence, it was war conducted at a speed that left traditional armies struggling to respond. The first demonstration of Blitzkrieg's effectiveness came with the invasion of Poland in September 1939. German forces advanced rapidly from multiple directions, supported by Luftwaffe air attacks that targeted military installations, communication lines, and transport hubs. The Polish army, though brave, was unprepared for this level of coordination and mobility. Within weeks, Poland was effectively defeated. The campaign demonstrated that modern warfare was no longer about static positions. Speed, technology, and coordination were decisive. Blitzkrieg became both a military tactic and a symbol of Germany's renewed power. After Poland, Germany turned its attention to Western Europe. The invasion of France in 1940 showcased the full potential of Blitzkrieg. German planners bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line by advancing through the Ardennes Forest, a region French commanders had deemed impassable for armored divisions. Tanks, motorized infantry, and air support moved in unison, striking deep into French territory before effective resistance could organize. Within 6 weeks, France had surrendered. The speed and decisiveness of this campaign stunned the world and elevated Germany's reputation as an unstoppable military force. Blitzkrieg was more than just technology or tactics. It was about integration. The Luftwaffe provided air superiority, bombing enemy positions, disrupting communication, and preventing reinforcements. Tanks, panzers, acted as spearheads, breaking through lines and creating gaps for infantry and artillery to exploit. Radio communication allowed commanders to coordinate movements in real time, something traditional armies could not match. Logistics, planning, and training were all synchronized to ensure that speed was maintained without sacrificing effectiveness. Every aspect of German military doctrine during these campaigns was designed for rapid, decisive results. Psychology played a critical role in Blitzkrieg's success. Speed and unpredictability created confusion and panic among enemy forces. Soldiers faced attacks from multiple directions, often cut off from communication and supply lines. Civilian populations were also affected, as cities were quickly overtaken, disrupting governance and morale. Blitzkrieg created a sense of inevitability. Opposing Germany seemed futile because the pace of attack prevented organized resistance. Fear became a force multiplier, amplifying the physical effects of military operations. The early successes of Blitzkrieg had profound strategic and political consequences. Germany's rapid victories altered the balance of power in Europe, intimidating both neutral nations and potential adversaries. Countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, and Denmark were occupied within days, further expanding Germany's influence and resources. The speed of conquest allowed Germany to consolidate gains before major international intervention could occur, demonstrating that tactical brilliance could translate directly into geopolitical advantage. However, Blitzkrieg was not infallible. It required excellent coordination, disciplined troops, and efficient logistics. Supply lines had to be maintained, fuel and ammunition had to be delivered on time, and communications had to be uninterrupted. Any breakdown could stall the advance, as would eventually be seen in later campaigns, particularly in the vast expanses of the Soviet Union. Yet in the early years, Germany's meticulous planning and modernized military allowed Blitzkrieg to succeed spectacularly, producing results that reshaped the world's understanding of warfare. The doctrine also reinforced the Nazi regime domestically. Early victories were used for propaganda to demonstrate the strength and superiority of the German state and its leadership. Hitler was celebrated as a military genius, and the sense of national pride reached unprecedented levels. The public associated speed, power, and efficiency with the regime itself. Success on the battlefield translated into legitimacy at home, consolidating support for both the military and political leadership. Technologically, Blitzkrieg accelerated the integration of tanks, aircraft, and motorized units. Germany's investment in mechanized warfare, combined with doctrinal innovation, allowed relatively small forces to achieve outsized effects. Coordination between the Army and Air Force, coupled with centralized command and decentralized execution, became a model studied and later adapted by other nations. The early campaigns demonstrated that modern warfare was no longer about numbers alone, but about agility, technology, and surprise. Yet, beyond the technical aspects, Blitzkrieg also represented a psychological and ideological statement. It reflected the Nazi worldview, aggressive, decisive, and unrelenting. It was not merely about defeating opponents, but about demonstrating the supposed superiority of German organization, strategy, and racial will. Early military successes reinforced the narrative of inevitability that had been cultivated through propaganda, creating a feedback loop of confidence, legitimacy, and momentum for the regime. By the end of the early campaigns, Germany had achieved a remarkable transformation. Within a year of the war's start, it had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Millions of soldiers and civilians witnessed the unprecedented speed of these operations, creating both awe and fear. Blitzkrieg had not only changed the map of Europe, but also revolutionized military theory, demonstrating how ideology, preparation, and innovation could combine to achieve extraordinary results. In conclusion, Blitzkrieg and Germany's early military successes illustrate the fusion of doctrine, technology, and psychology, Rapid, coordinated attacks overwhelmed opponents, while the speed of conquest amplified both fear and legitimacy. These victories reinforced Hitler's domestic authority, expanded territorial control, and reshaped the global understanding of modern warfare. The lessons of Blitzkrieg underscore how preparation, innovation, and relentless execution can transform not only military campaigns, but the broader trajectory of history itself. By the time Germany had conquered much of Europe through Blitzkrieg, the war was no longer just a series of battles on maps and front lines. It had become a system of occupation where millions of civilians lived under the direct control of the Nazi regime. Life under occupation varied depending on geography, ethnicity, and strategic importance, but one common thread ran through all occupied territories: the total and often terrifying imposition of Nazi authority. Understanding this period reveals not just the mechanics of conquest, but the everyday human experience under one of history's most repressive regimes. The first and most immediate impact of occupation was administrative. Germany imposed military governance in conquered territories, creating local structures that reported directly to Berlin. Cities and towns were often under curfews. Public gatherings were restricted, and travel was tightly controlled. The Nazi regime maintained a combination of military oversight and civilian bureaucracy to enforce policies, ensuring that even routine aspects of daily life, from commerce to education, were tightly monitored. Occupation authorities aimed to reshape society according to German priorities and to extract resources for the war effort. Economic control was a central feature of life under occupation. Germany requisitioned food, raw materials, and industrial outputs from occupied nations to support its military. Farms were taxed or forced to supply quotas. Factories redirected production toward German needs, and labor was often conscripted. In some regions, local populations faced severe shortages, rationing, and inflation. The Nazis applied economic pressure to maintain control, ensuring that resistance was both risky and costly. Ordinary civilians had to navigate a delicate balance between survival and compliance, often under threat of violence or imprisonment. Ideology was another tool of occupation. The Nazis promoted racial hierarchy in occupied territories, classifying populations according to perceived racial value. Jews, Romani people, Slavic populations, and other undesirable groups faced systemic persecution. This included forced relocation, property confiscation, forced labor, and, for many, eventual deportation to ghettos or extermination camps. These policies were part of a deliberate plan to exploit, control, and ultimately eliminate those considered threats or obstacles to the Nazi vision. Life under occupation meant constant awareness that one's status and safety were determined by arbitrary and discriminatory rules. Education and cultural life were also reshaped. Schools were often taken over to teach Nazi-approved curricula, emphasizing obedience, German language, and racial ideology. Cultural institutions, theaters, and media outlets were censored or replaced with propaganda intended to glorify the Reich. Local traditions and practices were suppressed if they conflicted with German goals. Even holidays and religious observances were sometimes restricted or manipulated to reinforce the presence and authority of the occupying power. Children, especially, were subject to ideological influence from a young age, shaping attitudes toward the occupiers and the war. Daily life under occupation was a constant negotiation between survival, adaptation, and resistance. Civilians developed strategies to cope with shortages, curfews, and bureaucratic interference. Black markets flourished as people sought essential goods, while informal networks provided food, news, and support. Acts of small resistance, hiding fugitives, forging documents, or sabotaging production, were widespread, though always dangerous. The balance between compliance and defiance defined much of civilian experience, as ordinary individuals navigated an environment where mistakes could be fatal and cooperation often morally compromising. Violence and fear were omnipresent. Occupying forces often employed terror to maintain control. Public executions, arbitrary arrests, and mass reprisals created a climate of intimidation. Resistance movements were met with brutal suppression. Families could be punished for the actions of a single member. Occupation was a psychological as well as physical experience, where the constant presence of power and surveillance shaped behavior, relationships, and decision making. Fear was a tool, an invisible force that kept millions in line without direct daily confrontation. Yet, despite repression, life persisted. Civilians adapted, formed communities, and maintained cultural practices in private. Religion, art, music, and clandestine education provided ways to preserve identity and hope. Underground networks emerged, sharing information and assisting those persecuted by the regime. These acts of resilience demonstrate the complexity of life under occupation. Survival depended not only on compliance, but on creativity, solidarity, and courage. Occupational policies were not uniform. In Western Europe, such as France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, daily life retained elements of normalcy under strict regulation, though fear and scarcity were constant. In Eastern Europe, particularly Poland and the Soviet Union, occupation policies were far more brutal, including systematic executions, forced labor, and ethnic cleansing. The Nazi approach varied by strategic objectives, racial ideology, and logistical considerations, but everywhere it relied on a combination of bureaucracy, coercion, and ideological enforcement. The psychological impact of occupation cannot be overstated. Civilians lived under continuous uncertainty. The threat of violence, arbitrary rule, and forced relocation shaped every decision. Communities were fractured by suspicion, collaboration, and survival strategies. Families had to hide loved ones. Children were indoctrinated or coerced, and ordinary social trust was undermined. Occupation turned everyday life into a series of calculated choices where safety, morality, and practicality were often in tension. Despite the oppressive nature of occupation, it also revealed the spectrum of human behavior. Collaboration occurred alongside resistance. Fear coexisted with bravery. Some civilians cooperated with authorities to protect themselves or their families, while others took extraordinary risks to assist neighbors, hide refugees, or sabotage German operations. The experience of occupation was not monolithic. It was a complex interplay of coercion, adaptation, and moral decision-making that affected every aspect of society. By the end of the early war years, life under Nazi occupation had become normalized in many regions, though at tremendous cost. The combination of administrative control, economic exploitation, ideological enforcement, and terror ensured that resistance was difficult and survival precarious. Civilians experienced the war not just as a distant conflict, but as an intrusion into every aspect of daily life. Occupation reshaped families, economies, and communities, creating both suffering and resilience. Understanding life under occupation highlights the human dimension of Nazi Germany's expansion. Beyond battles and strategies, the war affected ordinary people in profound and enduring ways. Occupation was an instrument of control, a method of extracting resources, and a tool of ideological enforcement. It created a world where fear, adaptation, and resilience defined the human experience, and where the consequences of living under a totalitarian system were felt in homes, streets, and workplaces across Europe. While Nazi Germany established control across much of Europe, it was never absolute. Across occupied territories, individuals and groups risked everything to resist. Resistance movements were as diverse as the nations they emerged from, ranging from clandestine networks distributing information to armed guerrilla campaigns. Understanding these movements is crucial because they reveal the human spirit under extreme oppression and the ways ordinary people challenged one of history's most ruthless regimes. Resistance emerged for a variety of reasons. In some cases, it was patriotic, a desire to restore national sovereignty and defend cultural identity. In others, it was moral or ideological, opposing the persecution of Jews, political dissidents, or other targeted populations. Economic motivations also played a role. Sabotage, theft, or strikes could hinder German control while benefiting local communities. Whatever the motivation, participating in resistance was incredibly dangerous. German forces responded with overwhelming violence, executing civilians, destroying villages, and making examples of anyone suspected of defiance. One of the most famous examples of organized resistance was the French resistance. Initially small and fragmented, the French underground eventually grew into a sophisticated network that coordinated intelligence gathering, sabotage, and support for Allied operations. They produced underground newspapers to counter Nazi propaganda, helped Jews and Allied soldiers escape, and carried out attacks on German supply lines. The resistance relied on secrecy, local knowledge, and ingenuity. Ordinary citizens, including students, clergy, farmers, and professionals, risked arrest or execution to contribute to the cause. In Eastern Europe, resistance often took a more guerrilla-oriented form. In Poland, the Home Army, Armia Krajowa, carried out both sabotage and intelligence operations. They trained in secret, prepared for uprisings, and maintained connections with the government in exile in London. Partisans operated in forests, using knowledge of the terrain to strike German convoys, ambush patrols, and disrupt supply lines. The harshness of occupation, combined with the scale of repression, made these operations extremely dangerous, yet they persisted as acts of defiance and survival. The Soviet Union also saw widespread partisan activity following Germany's invasion in 1941. Partisans in Belarus, Ukraine, and other regions carried out guerrilla attacks, sabotaging railways, attacking supply depots, and ambushing small German units. They often operated in harsh conditions, relying on local support, improvisation, and resilience. Civilians in occupied villages faced brutal retaliation, including massacres, for assisting partisans. Yet the movements endured, demonstrating the resilience and determination of those under occupation. Resistance was not limited to military action. Intelligence networks played a critical role in aiding the Allies. The Polish resistance, for example, provided early reports on German military movements, which proved invaluable for strategic planning. Norwegian and Danish resistance groups transmitted weather reports, troop movements, and sabotage operations to Britain. These efforts required meticulous secrecy, as even a single betrayal could destroy entire cells. The courage and dedication of these individuals saved countless lives and contributed directly to the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. Underground press and propaganda were also key elements of resistance. Producing and distributing newspapers, leaflets, and posters countered German narratives and maintained morale among civilians. These materials were often handwritten or mimeographed under extreme secrecy, passed from hand to hand. They informed populations about the progress of the war, exposed Nazi atrocities, and encouraged defiance. Even small acts of information sharing became acts of resistance, asserting the truth against a regime built on lies and coercion. Resistance often required collaboration across social boundaries. Networks included individuals from all walks of life: students, workers, clergy, military deserters, and former officials. Women played particularly important roles, serving as couriers, spies, and organizers. Their contributions were often overlooked, but they were critical to the operation's survival. Similarly, marginalized populations, including Jews and Romani people, participated when possible, contributing intelligence, shelter, and support despite facing the highest risks. The effectiveness of resistance varied. In some regions, movements successfully disrupted German operations and aided Allied advances. In others, reprisals were so severe that they discouraged active participation. However, the symbolic impact was enormous. Resistance provided hope, demonstrated that the Nazi regime was not invincible, and preserved the integrity of local cultures and communities. These acts of defiance reminded the world that even under totalitarian control, courage and conscience could survive. Collaboration between resistance groups and the Allies became increasingly important as the war progressed. In France, the Resistance coordinated sabotage operations in preparation for the D-Day invasion, attacking railways and communication networks to slow German responses. In the Balkans, partisan forces liberated towns and disrupted German supply lines, tying down troops that could have been deployed elsewhere. Intelligence from resistance groups informed Allied strategies, provided early warnings, and enabled targeted operations. The relationship between occupied populations and external forces became a force multiplier for the war effort. Resistance also shaped post-war memory and identity. In many countries, participation in underground movements became a source of national pride and moral validation after the war. Monuments, museums, and stories celebrated the courage of those who fought in secret against overwhelming odds. The sacrifices of these individuals highlighted the human capacity for resilience and a moral action, even under extreme danger. Resistance demonstrated that while Nazi occupation was brutal and comprehensive, it could never fully extinguish the human spirit. In conclusion, resistance movements across Europe were diverse, courageous, and profoundly impactful. From armed guerrilla campaigns in Eastern Europe to clandestine intelligence networks in France and Norway, these movements challenged German control, saved lives, and contributed to the eventual Allied victory. Resistance required ingenuity, bravery, and sacrifice, often at the cost of life itself. While not always strategically decisive, the moral and psychological significance of resistance cannot be overstated. It showed that, even in the darkest times, defiance and courage endured. Life under occupation was harsh, but human agency persisted, a vital counterpoint to the overwhelming power of the Nazi regime. By 1941, Nazi Germany had achieved remarkable military success in Western Europe. But Hitler's ambitions extended far beyond France, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia. Central to his vision was the conquest of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, a campaign designed to secure Lebensraum, living space for the German people, and to eliminate what he considered ideological and racial enemies. The Eastern Front would become the largest, deadliest, and most brutal theater of World War II, reshaping both military strategy and the human cost of conflict. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, was the codename for the invasion of the Soviet Union. It involved an unprecedented mobilization of forces, nearly 3 million German troops, 600,000 Axis allies, and thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. Hitler's plan was ambitious and in many ways unprecedented. The goal was not just territorial conquest, but the complete destruction of the Soviet state and the subjugation or elimination of its population. Ideology and strategy were intertwined. The campaign was as much about racial conquest as it was about defeating a military opponent. The scale of the Eastern Front was staggering. Unlike the compact, mechanized operations in France or Poland, the Soviet Union presented vast distances, harsh terrain, and extreme climates. Logistics became a critical challenge. Fuel, ammunition, and supplies had to travel hundreds of kilometers across poorly developed roads and railways. Communication lines were stretched, and the sheer size of the front created pockets where both German and Soviet units could be isolated. Planning for such an operation required a combination of strategy, speed, and improvisation on an unprecedented scale. Blitzkrieg tactics were applied initially, with rapid armored advances designed to encircle and destroy Soviet forces. Early successes were dramatic. Cities fell, massive numbers of Soviet troops were captured, and German forces seemed unstoppable. The speed and coordination of attacks shocked both the Red Army and the civilian population. However, these early victories masked underlying vulnerabilities. The harsh Russian winter, extended supply lines, and the Soviet Union's sheer manpower would soon challenge the German advance in ways that no Western European campaign had. The human cost on both sides was immense. Civilians in occupied territories faced brutal repression, forced labor, and the systematic persecution of Jews and other minority groups. German forces, following Hitler's ideological directives, committed widespread atrocities against prisoners of war and civilians, particularly in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. Mass executions, village burnings, and punitive measures were used to enforce control and terrorize local populations. The Eastern Front became a theater not only of military conflict, but of systematic cruelty on a scale rarely seen before. Logistical and environmental challenges also slowed the German advance. The summer of 1941 had allowed rapid movement, but by autumn, roads became impassable, rivers swollen, and German supply lines stretched thin. Winter brought extreme cold, inadequate clothing, and mechanical failures, further straining the army. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, began mobilizing reserves, relocating factories eastward, and reinforcing defensive positions. The war on the Eastern Front was no longer a swift campaign. It became a grinding struggle of attrition, where victory was uncertain and casualties mounted daily. The Soviet response was a combination of conventional and guerrilla warfare. While many cities and regions were captured, Soviet troops often withdrew strategically, preserving manpower and staging counteroffensives. Partisans and local resistance fighters disrupted supply lines, sabotaged infrastructure, and harassed German units. These activities not only slowed the German advance, but also tied down forces that might otherwise have been deployed to achieve decisive breakthroughs. The resilience and determination of the Soviet state and population became a defining feature of the conflict. Ideology intensified the brutality of the Eastern Front. Hitler's directives labeled Slavs as inferior, Jews as targets for extermination, and political commissars as enemies to be executed. Military operations were combined with systematic genocide, creating a theater where strategic objectives and ideological imperatives were inseparable. Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, followed the advancing armies, carrying out mass executions. The invasion was thus not only a conventional war, but also a campaign of racial terror, making the Eastern Front the deadliest and most morally complex front of the conflict. The scale of the fighting, geography, and harsh conditions also pushed military innovation and adaptation. German forces had to develop new strategies for urban combat, winter warfare, and combined arms coordination over vast distances. Soviet forces adapted as well, improving anti-tank tactics, fortifications, and the integration of infantry, armor, and air power. Both sides learned, adapted, and escalated, making the Eastern Front a crucible of military evolution that influenced warfare for decades to come. Operation Barbarossa initially achieved dramatic territorial gains, but over time, the combination of distance, climate, Soviet resilience, and logistical strain stalled the German advance. Cities like Moscow remained out of reach, and the winter counteroffensive of 1941 to 42 demonstrated that Germany's initial momentum could not guarantee ultimate victory. The Eastern Front evolved into a long-term struggle defined by massive casualties, destruction, and the mobilization of entire societies for total war. The human, material, and psychological toll was unparalleled in history. Ultimately, the invasion of the Soviet Union marked a turning point in World War II. It demonstrated both the power and the limitations of Germany's military machine. Early successes showed the effectiveness of speed, coordination, and ideology-driven motivation, but the challenges of geography, climate, and determined resistance highlighted the fragility of even a seemingly unstoppable force. The Eastern Front became a test not only of strategy and equipment, but also of endurance, adaptability, and human will. By examining the Eastern Front, we see a war defined by extremes, incredible operational scale, unimaginable human suffering, and ideological intensity. Hitler's ambition collided with reality, forcing the German military to confront logistical nightmares, strategic dilemmas, and a relentless enemy. The campaign reshaped the course of the war, drained German resources, and foreshadowed the eventual turning of the tide against the Reich. The Eastern Front stands as both a testament to human resilience and a warning of the catastrophic consequences when ideology and aggression combine in total war. When we talk about Germany during World War II, it's impossible to separate its military strategy from the role of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Under the leadership of Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe became one of the most powerful and strategically influential air forces in the world. Its development, tactics, and operational use not only shaped battles, but also transformed the very concept of modern warfare. Understanding the Luftwaffe gives us insight into Germany's broader military approach. Speed, innovation, intimidation, and precision combined with ideological zeal. The Luftwaffe's origins trace back to the interwar period when Hitler and his allies began rebuilding Germany's military capabilities despite the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. Initially, this required creative workarounds, including secret pilot training programs abroad and covert development of aircraft. By the mid-1930s, Germany was quietly but rapidly establishing an air force capable of both strategic bombing and close air support. Hermann Göring, a charismatic yet ruthless figure, oversaw this development, emphasizing efficiency, discipline, and doctrinal innovation. Air power was central to Nazi military thinking. The Luftwaffe was designed not just to support ground forces, but to dominate the skies, paralyze enemy forces, and enable rapid territorial conquest. Its doctrine emphasized close coordination with ground operations, particularly the armored divisions that executed Blitzkrieg tactics. Stuka dive bombers became symbolic of this approach, fast, precise, and terrifyingly effective in disrupting enemy formations. The coordination between air and ground units was revolutionary at the time, allowing Germany to achieve rapid, decisive victories in Poland, France, and later campaigns. During the early stages of the war, the Luftwaffe's effectiveness was overwhelming. In the invasion of Poland, it provided crucial reconnaissance, destroyed enemy infrastructure, and demoralized troops with relentless bombing campaigns. In the Western Campaign, its precision strikes against bridges, railways, and fortifications allowed German armored divisions to bypass traditional defenses and penetrate deep into enemy territory. Speed, surprise, and psychological impact were key elements of the Luftwaffe's strategy. Enemy forces were not just defeated, they were often stunned and disoriented, unable to coordinate an effective response. The Luftwaffe's role expanded beyond direct battlefield support. It became a tool for strategic bombing aimed at crippling industrial capacity, transportation networks, and civilian morale. The Battle of Britain in 1940 marked a critical test of Germany's air power. Initially, the Luftwaffe targeted airfields and military infrastructure, seeking to establish air superiority as a prelude to invasion. However, the campaign gradually shifted to bombing cities in an attempt to break civilian morale. This strategy, while innovative, ultimately failed to achieve decisive results, revealing both the potential and the limits of strategic air power. Technology and innovation were central to the Luftwaffe's capabilities. Germany invested in advanced aircraft, including the Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter and the Ju 87 Stuka dive bomber. Pilots received rigorous training in tactics, navigation, and coordination with ground forces. Communication systems allowed real-time updates, facilitating rapid responses to dynamic battlefield conditions. The Luftwaffe's integration of technology, doctrine, and personnel training exemplified the German approach to warfare. Meticulous planning combined with operational flexibility. However, reliance on the Luftwaffe also had vulnerabilities. Its focus on close air support and tactical missions sometimes limited its strategic reach. In prolonged campaigns, supply shortages, maintenance issues, and pilot fatigue reduced effectiveness. During the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe underestimated both the resilience of the Royal Air Force and the importance of radar technology, leading to significant losses. These limitations highlighted that air power, while transformative, could not substitute for logistical planning, industrial capacity, or strategic depth. On the Eastern Front, the Luftwaffe initially played a crucial role in supporting rapid advances into Soviet territory. It provided reconnaissance, interdicted supply lines, and assisted in encircling Soviet forces. Stuka dive bombers, fighters, and medium bombers disrupted enemy formations and reinforced the speed of Blitzkrieg operations. However, the vast distances, harsh weather, and sheer size of the Soviet Union eventually stretched the Luftwaffe's capabilities. Fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and attrition began to erode its dominance, revealing the operational limits of even a technologically advanced air force. The Luftwaffe's impact extended beyond military outcomes. It had profound psychological effects. Air raids instilled fear, disrupted civilian life, and shaped perceptions of German power. The sight of Stuka sirens, or massed aircraft formations, became emblematic of German dominance. This psychological dimension was integral to Nazi strategy. Terror, intimidation, and shock amplified the physical effects of military operations. Air power was not only a weapon of destruction, but a tool of psychological warfare, influencing both enemy combatants and civilian populations. Strategically, the Luftwaffe contributed to the German approach of integrated total warfare. It was part of a broader system that combined rapid ground maneuvers, strategic bombing, propaganda, and ideological enforcement. Successes in early campaigns reinforced Hitler's image as a military genius and validated the regime's investment in technology and coordination. However, prolonged conflict exposed structural weaknesses, including limited production capacity, dependence on experienced pilots, and overextension across multiple fronts. The Luftwaffe also played a role in occupation and enforcement. It facilitated rapid troop movements, supported anti-partisan operations, and conducted bombing raids against resistant strongholds. Civilians in occupied territories experienced the Luftwaffe not just as a military tool, but as a presence that could strike unpredictably, further reinforcing the power of the Nazi regime. The combination of mobility, firepower, and psychological impact made air power central to both conquest and control. In conclusion, the Luftwaffe was far more than an air force. It was a central instrument of Nazi military, strategic, and ideological objectives. Its innovations in coordination, tactics, and technology reshaped modern warfare. Early successes demonstrated the power of integrated air-ground operations and psychological intimidation, while later limitations revealed the challenges of sustaining dominance across vast territories. The Luftwaffe's story is one of ambition, innovation, and ultimately the limits of power, a key chapter in understanding the military might and vulnerabilities of Nazi Germany during World War II. While German forces advanced across Europe, life at home in Germany was a complex mixture of normalcy, mobilization, and ideological reinforcement. The Nazi regime understood that sustaining a war effort required more than just military victories. It required control, participation, and morale on the home front. From the mid-1930s through the early 1940s, German civilians experienced a carefully managed combination of propaganda, rationing, social incentives, and labor mobilization. Economically, the state reorganized industries to support the war effort. Factories that once produced consumer goods were converted to manufacture tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and weapons. Labor shortages were addressed through a combination of incentives and coercion, including compulsory work programs for men and women, as well as forced labor from occupied territories. The strength, through Joy Program and other social initiatives, maintained a sense of national unity and reward for compliance, offering leisure activities, cultural events, and even holidays, all carefully choreographed to reinforce loyalty to the regime. Rationing became a part of daily life as the war progressed. Food, clothing, and fuel were limited, requiring citizens to adjust their routines and rely on ingenuity. Families learned to stretch resources, grow gardens, and participate in collective efforts such as scrap metal drives. At the same time, the state provided ideological justification for these hardships, framing them as sacrifices for the greater glory of Germany and the Führer. Propaganda emphasized the heroic role of citizens supporting the military, creating a sense of shared purpose. Social policies reinforced Nazi ideals. Women were encouraged to focus on family and child rearing, contributing to the nation's future through motherhood rather than industrial labor. Youth were fully immersed in Nazi organizations, absorbing ideological lessons, physical training, and loyalty to Hitler. Education and cultural programming were carefully controlled to sustain conformity, normalize hardship, and foster pride in Germany's expanding empire. Even entertainment, such as cinema and radio, served dual purposes: distraction and ideological reinforcement. Despite these efforts, the home front experienced tension and fear. Air raids, particularly later in the war, brought the conflict into civilian neighborhoods, destroying homes and infrastructure. Casualties among soldiers, often initially hidden, gradually eroded morale. Families worried constantly about loved ones at the front, while resistance, rumors, and small acts of defiance persisted, reminding the regime that total control was never fully achievable. The German home front was therefore a complex landscape, a mix of normal routines, patriotic zeal, ideological conditioning, and the omnipresent stress of war. By blending propaganda, social engineering, and economic mobilization, the Nazi state sought to maintain productivity, loyalty, and public morale, a precarious balance that would be increasingly strained as the war turned against Germany. Propaganda was the lifeblood of the Nazi regime, a tool so essential that every aspect of society was influenced by it. Joseph Goebbels, as Minister of Propaganda, understood that controlling information was as important as controlling armies, newspapers, radio, cinema, posters, and public rallies were all leveraged to glorify the Reich, demonize enemies, and unify the population under Hitler's vision. The Nazis perfected repetition, symbolism, and emotional manipulation. Simple, powerful messages were broadcast relentlessly. The Führer as savior, the Aryan race as superior, Jews and other enemies as threats. Citizens were inundated with images of military victories, heroic soldiers, and model citizens contributing to the war effort. Films like Triumph of the Will and radio broadcasts created a sense of awe and inevitability, blending spectacle with ideology. Control of information extended to censorship. Newspapers and books critical of the regime were banned, intellectuals silenced, and dissenting voices eliminated. Schools and universities became sites of indoctrination, shaping generations to accept propaganda as truth. Even humor, songs, and cultural expressions were monitored to ensure alignment with state messaging. Propaganda also served as a tool for war mobilization. Posters encouraged enlistment, labor participation, and rationing compliance. Enemy nations were demonized to justify military action, while victories were amplified to maintain morale. Citizens were convinced that their sacrifices were noble and essential for Germany's destiny. Perhaps most insidiously, propaganda normalized atrocities. The persecution of Jews, the treatment of prisoners, and the exploitation of occupied territories were framed as necessary, patriotic, or even morally justified. By controlling perception, the regime minimized resistance, cultivated complicity, and shaped the moral framework of millions. In short, Nazi propaganda was not mere advertising. It was a totalizing system of psychological control, shaping thought, belief, and action across every layer of German society. It demonstrates the terrifying power of information when wielded with precision, ideology, and ruthlessness. By 1942, Nazi Germany seemed unstoppable, sweeping across Europe and into the Soviet Union. But the tides of war were about to turn dramatically. On the Eastern Front, the Battle of Stalingrad became a symbol of resilience, strategy, and the enormous human cost of Hitler's ambitions. Simultaneously, in the Pacific Theater, the Battle of Midway showcased the limits of Axis-aligned powers. Though not directly German, it had a strategic impact by diverting attention and resources, reinforcing the global dimension of the conflict. Stalingrad, a city on the Volga, was not just a military target, it was a symbol. Hitler demanded its capture for strategic and ideological reasons, seeking to cut Soviet supply lines and assert dominance over the Soviet state. The German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, advanced with the expectation of swift victory, confident in the momentum of Blitzkrieg-style operations. However, the Soviets, aware of the city's importance, mobilized massive defenses, reinforced by civilians, snipers, and urban fortifications. The fighting quickly became brutal and close quarters, turning every street, building, and factory into a battlefield. Winter compounded the German army's difficulties. Supply lines were overextended, reinforcements were delayed, and the harsh climate caused frostbite, illness, and equipment failures. Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, encircling the Sixth Army and cutting them off from resupply. Despite Hitler's insistence on holding positions, Paulus's army became trapped, facing starvation, disease, and relentless attacks. By February 1943, the German forces surrendered, marking the first major, decisive defeat for Nazi Germany in the war. Stalingrad shifted momentum on the Eastern Front, boosting Soviet morale and signaling that Germany's advance could be halted. The psychological impact of Stalingrad was enormous. German society, previously accustomed to rapid victories and propaganda of invincibility, confronted the reality of a protracted, costly conflict. Military losses and the symbolic defeat undermined confidence in Hitler's leadership. For the Allies, Stalingrad became a beacon of possibility. Axis powers could be resisted, beaten, and eventually defeated. It reshaped strategy, forcing Germany to fight defensively on multiple fronts, straining resources and exposing vulnerabilities that had previously been masked by early victories. Meanwhile, on the global stage, battles like Midway demonstrated that Axis powers could be challenged beyond Europe. While Germany was not directly involved, the strategic setbacks of its allies diverted resources, limited options, and contributed indirectly to Germany's overextension. Collectively, these turning points marked a shift from rapid German dominance to the slow, grinding attrition that would define the war's later years. By 1943-1945, the tide had decisively turned against Nazi Germany. The combination of strategic defeats, resource shortages, and overwhelming Allied pressure set the stage for Germany's collapse. The Eastern Front bled German forces, while air raids and Allied invasions weakened infrastructure and morale at home. The once invincible war machine faced relentless pressure on multiple fronts, and the regime's ideological rigidity often worsened its strategic position. The Battle of Kursk in 1943 marked another critical setback. German forces attempted a massive offensive against Soviet positions, but encountered well-prepared defenses, extensive fortifications, and numerical superiority. The failure depleted experienced troops, tanks, and aircraft, forcing Germany into a defensive posture for the remainder of the war. On the Western Front, the Normandy landings in 1944 opened a second front, stretching Germany's military capabilities even further and ensuring that resources had to be divided against overwhelming odds. At home, Germany faced total mobilization pressures. Rationing intensified. Cities were destroyed in strategic bombing campaigns, and civilian morale waned under constant threat. Propaganda attempted to maintain hope, but the reality of military setbacks, casualties, and collapsing infrastructure could not be hidden. Resistance, both passive and active, increased, reflecting the diminishing authority and cohesion of the Nazi state. By 1945, Soviet forces had advanced into eastern Germany, while Western allies pushed from the west. Berlin became the final focal point of conflict. Hitler, isolated in his bunker, refused to surrender, relying on symbolic gestures and fanaticism while the city around him collapsed. German military command disintegrated, and ordinary soldiers faced surrender, death, or retreat. On May 8, 1945, Germany officially capitulated, bringing World War II in Europe to an end. The consequences were profound. Germany lay in ruins. Millions of soldiers and civilians were dead, and the moral, social, and political fabric of the nation was shattered. The Holocaust revealed the extremes of Nazi ideology, leaving a legacy of horror and a global commitment to prevent such atrocities in the future. The war's end did not erase the lessons of German militarism and ideology. The combination of technological power, strategic brilliance, and totalitarian control can be catastrophic if unchecked. Germany's decline and final defeat illustrate the limits of ambition, ideology, and centralized power. While early victories seemed unstoppable, overreach, logistical strain, and the resilience of opponents turned initial triumphs into eventual catastrophe. It's a story of both human ingenuity and hubris, a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked ideology, ruthless expansion, and the human cost of war. No discussion of Nazi Germany would be complete without confronting the horrors of the Holocaust and the broader war crimes perpetrated under the regime. While military strategies, Blitzkrieg tactics, and propaganda dominated headlines, behind the front lines, the Nazi state carried out one of history's most systematic and brutal campaigns of genocide. Understanding this period is critical to fully grasping the moral and human cost of Germany's war. The Holocaust was a state-directed effort to eliminate Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and other groups deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. This campaign was meticulously planned and executed, combining bureaucratic efficiency with ideological fanaticism. Jews were forced into ghettos, where starvation, disease, and overcrowding were rampant. Deportations to concentration and extermination camps followed, often under the guise of resettlement to obscure the true intent. Camps such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor became sites of systematic mass murder, where millions perished. The Nazis implemented these atrocities with chilling organization. The SS, under Heinrich Himmler, coordinated security, transport, and execution. Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, followed military advances into Eastern Europe, conducting mass shootings and terror campaigns. Victims were dehumanized through propaganda and policy, stripped of rights, and forced to endure extreme suffering. The scale of these crimes was unprecedented. Estimates suggest 6 million Jews and millions of others were murdered, leaving scars on families, communities, and entire nations. War crimes extended beyond genocide. The Nazi military often violated laws of war, executing prisoners, destroying civilian infrastructure, and terrorizing occupied populations. In the Soviet Union, massacres and scorched earth tactics were widespread. In Western Europe, reprisal killings and deportations were common. Forced labor exploited millions from occupied territories, often under brutal conditions, leading to death from starvation, overwork, or disease. Propaganda and bureaucracy facilitated these crimes. Ordinary citizens and officials were implicated through complicity, administrative oversight, or passive acceptance. The regime normalized murder and repression as part of the war effort, framing atrocities as necessary for security, efficiency, or racial purification. The Holocaust and war crimes demonstrate the dangerous convergence of ideology, organization, and obedience, a calculated system that made mass atrocity possible. Understanding this dark chapter emphasizes that Nazi Germany's power was not only military, but moral and ideological. The Holocaust remains a reminder of the consequences of unchecked extremism, dehumanization, and state control. It is both a historical record and a cautionary tale, underscoring the responsibility of societies to uphold human rights and resist tyranny. Following Germany's surrender in May 1945, the country faced unprecedented destruction. Cities lay in ruins from bombing campaigns. Infrastructure was shattered, and millions of civilians and soldiers were dead or displaced. The moral, political, and economic collapse of the nation created the most complex reconstruction challenge in modern history. Germany's post-war story is one of division, accountability, and eventual renewal. Allied powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and later France, occupied Germany, each administering zones with different priorities. Denazification became a central task, removing Nazi officials from power, prosecuting war criminals in the Nuremberg trials, and dismantling propaganda networks. The trials were a watershed moment, establishing that individuals and states could be held accountable for crimes against humanity, genocide, and violations of international law. Economically, Germany was in ruins. Factories were destroyed, transportation networks unusable, and the population faced food shortages. Reconstruction required enormous effort, international aid, and the mobilization of remaining resources. In the Western zones, the Marshall Plan provided critical support, helping rebuild infrastructure, stabilize currency, and restart industry. The result was the eventual economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, transforming West Germany into a modern, prosperous state by the 1950s. Politically, Germany was divided. The Western zones eventually became the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, while the Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. The division reflected ideological, political, and strategic tensions, with different approaches to governance, economy, and society. West Germany embraced democracy, free markets, and integration with Western Europe, while East Germany adopted Soviet-style socialism and central planning. The division persisted until reunification in 1990, leaving a lasting imprint on German identity and European geopolitics. Society faced the challenge of reconciling the past, millions of Germans had to confront complicity, victimhood, and survival under Nazi rule. Education, public memory, and memorialization became central to shaping a post-war national identity. Memorials, museums, and historical research preserved the memory of victims and atrocities, emphasizing the lessons of the past to prevent repetition. Reconstruction was not just physical or political, but moral. Germany's reintegration into the international community depended on acknowledging responsibility, rebuilding institutions, and fostering democratic values. The post-war period transformed Germany from a militarized, totalitarian state into a society striving for accountability, human rights, and stability, a remarkable transformation given the scale of destruction and moral collapse. In conclusion, post-war Germany illustrates both the consequences of Nazi ambition and the resilience of human societies. Through occupation, reconstruction, and eventual reunification, Germany rebuilt physically, politically, and socially. It became a reminder that even after the most catastrophic failures and crimes, societies can recover, learn, and redefine themselves. This final chapter emphasizes that history is not only a record of triumph and tragedy, but also a source of reflection, responsibility, and hope. Now, with a smile on your face, you will have a good understanding of World War II Germany, its rise, its fall, and the lessons it left behind. Close your eyes, let the echoes of history fade into silence, and rest well, my friend. Good night, dear friend. See you next time.